Live, this is the Crew Lounge, where knowledgeable people come to discuss railroading and model railroading topics. Pull up a chair and let's get started.
Hey, we're not. Oh, there we are. Hey, I've pulled up my chair. These guys have pulled up their chairs, so let's get started. I'm John, your host for the TSG Live Crew Lounge. This is a panel discussion that we do once a month, and I'm joined by some great friends here and very knowledgeable people. And why don't we just jump right in? One thing I do want to mention is we're taking questions in our live chat, and we also have live chat moderators who will probably try to keep things on track in there, no pun intended. And so it looks like Mark is having a little connection issue. So why don't we go through our introductions first? And we'll go to you first, Rob, since Mark is just a spinning little thing right now. Welcome.
Okay. Hey, Rob Spangler, Western Pacific 8 Subdivision, coming at you from Utah. Hi.
Welcome. Jack, I think we all know who you are, but maybe someone watching doesn't. Who the heck are you?
My name is Jack Burgess. I modeled Yosemite Valley Railroad, August 1939. Live in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Looks like Seth is. Oh, there you are. Seth, are you with us?
I'm with you. Let's
Okay.
see. I'm Seth Neumann. I modeled the Union Pacific in the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area in spring of 1999. I also live in the Bay Area.
Byron, we'll go to you next. We'll go back to Mark after you, since Mark was sort of MIA there for a second.
Yeah, I'm Byron Henderson. I'm editor of the Layout Design SIG's Layout Design Journal and a custom model railroad designer, and I live in San Jose.
Mark, it's your turn since you're with us now.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why I got booted, but my name is Mark Granados, and I live in beautiful Roseville, California, and I have been designing layouts for a better part of 15 years or so, and I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Well then, we can go to Byron. Byron, since you're the Layout Design Special Interest Group Journal editor, maybe we should have you kick this off.
All right, let me, I'll just share a quick slide and some ideas that we have been using in the Layout Design SIG to kind of talk about a structure of layout design thinking. A lot of people think layout design is just plopping components down until you run out of space. And that's a plan, not a good plan, but it's a plan. But we like to think in terms of, or one way to think about it is in terms of phases. The first is a conceptual phase that is a very unbounded, nonlinear kind of a phase. What do you want to see in your layout? What are the kinds of things that are signature industries or locales? What is the era? So it's a very free form. This is before you've drawn a single line. And then there's a structural phase, which based on that conceptual phase and the space you have, this is where it gets to scale. And you have to figure out how you're going to wind whatever fits into that space. And only after you've done both those things, and in fact, you can keep going back to the conceptual phase to check your work and see if you're still on track, so to speak. Only after all of that do you do the detail work. So if you look at the time spent, a lot of the time is going to be spent on the detail. But in terms of importance, the real importance comes earlier in the conceptual phase when you're really trying to figure out what's the story you want to tell, whether it's an operations story, whether it's a model rail fanning and scenery story, whatever is the vision that you have for your layout, that's what you're doing in that conceptual phase.
Very good. And it makes sense to me. One of the things that I've often thought of is I'm sort of a methodical person, and I like to make plans before I start videotaping stuff. And I think that you can apply that same principle to your layouts, right?
Sure. I think the whole idea of having some overall vision in mind that you can go back and check your work. That's your touchstone, and you can say, does this make sense? Does it make sense for there to be a yard there? How big a yard? Do I need a yard at all? All of those things you can check by coming back to your original concept to see if it makes sense. And because a lot of people are kind of adrift in terms of their concept, they can get into the detail phase too soon, get too worried about a yard ladder or the track layout for some industry, and not really know whether it should be there or not.
Yeah. Now,
I was going to say, might you ask yourself the question first of why plan a layout? I think a lot of what Byron was just saying applies to that question. Why would you want to plan a layout? Well, the very first reason I could think of is that I remember the phrase of, if you can't find the time to do it right the first time, figure on finding the time to do it over again. And I think that's one of the big reasons you want to plan a layout, as well as it'll save you a whole lot of grief, money, and probably friendships too, if you make a plan on it.
So I just noticed a question. Do you mind if I answer a question real quick, John?
No, that's great.
Yeah, I noticed a question someone asked, is the layout design SIG specifically prototypical? Do they also do prototype and freelance layout? The answer is yes. Layout design is not necessarily just prototypical. In fact, the last issue of the Layout Design Journal, the first article, and really a great article, I thought, was a fellow who's built a display layout, 5x7 ON30, that replicates the mine train through Nature's Wonderland ride from Disneyland. It's a beautiful layout, has a lot of animation, lighting effects. So we very much, the idea is you want to only make new mistakes. That's the motto of the LDSIG. And really, as Mark was saying, the reason to plan is you want to make as few old mistakes as possible. You want to be creative in your mistakes, make new mistakes. So yeah, the layout design SIG and layout design concepts in general are not just for ops, not just for prototypical designs. We have some examples here where Jack's layout is very prototypical, probably down to what books were on bookshelves in some of the buildings. Rob has taken kind of a proto-freelance approach, added on to something that was already there. Stop me if I say anything wrong, Rob. Seth's is pretty prototypical with a few tweaks to make it fit in the room. So I think, you can have a lot of different approaches. The key thing is not just ignoring this need, as Mark says, the need to plan so that you don't waste time and money.
Well, I'll speak up as a civil engineer, now retired. I can't even comprehend doing a layout without a detailed plan. All my track is hand laid, and so it was not able to take flex track and lay it on the floor and work up, and then so my layout plan was a 2x3 sheet of paper, so at a very large scale, and I included room for spiral curves into every curve except in the yard. You can't add spiral curves as you're working because you've got to allow that tolerance to do it. And they make a huge difference in operation. Trains go around a curve and they don't just start going straight and then suddenly they're turning. They ease into it, and that's exactly what the prototype did.
So I can provide kind of a personal example of where somebody I actually worked with on his layout didn't have a plan. Well, he had a plan, and I asked him, well, where is your plan? And he says, oh, it's in my head. Okay. Gee, do you have a printout port in your head so I can print this out and look at it? Well, obviously that wasn't the case. And I was building turnouts for the gentleman. And this was, these were large scale turnouts too. These were Proto 48 turnouts. And so he told me what he was going to do, and he had the bench work down, and he kind of sort of waved his hand over what he was doing. Okay, I'll go build you some switches for that. So it'd take me about a week to do that, maybe 2 weeks, depending on what he wanted. I come back, and I look at what he's got, and it's changed. He changed his mind. Well, okay, now what? I want to do this, and I want to do that. That happened for about, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 months before I finally kind of threw in the towel and said, you have all these switches I built for you, and you paid good money for them, but you can't use them because a lot of them were custom-made switches, custom curves and things like that. So another good reason to come up with a plan is to avoid that kind of, basically avoid model railroad chaos, especially when you're, like if you're looking to do a theme of operations, maybe you're really into operations as opposed to just recreational running. That's going to be even more of a case of needing a plan, because if you don't, the first time you try to go operate, all of a sudden you're going to find all sorts of things that maybe I should have done that before. We've got 2 people working over in the same spot, one in the upper level, one in the lower level, and they're running into each other, and it just isn't working out very well. So anyway, good reason to take a plan. I'm curious, how many of our panel are engineers or were engineers? Jack said he was a civil engineer. Okay. Anybody else?
I was a marine biologist.
Okay.
I was a political scientist who ran product management at a major corporation, so I'm sort of an engineer, but I certainly don't have an engineering degree.
Well, basically, it sounds like we have a lot of people whose occupations required planning, required advanced outlooks and ideas before they really got into their job. I was a network administrator. And before that, I was a programmer. Before that, I was an electronic technician, and none of that stuff that I did really would have worked very well without some sort of planning, some sort of methodical thinking, as I've heard it called. And really, that's what you want to do when you start planning the layout, is do it in a methodical way. Byron's chart was a great chart that basically kind of gave you an overall idea of how to go about an overall methodical plan, top to bottom.
So if I could jump in, just a quick question, John, or to answer the question that Sydney put up. The Layout Design SIG is an NMRA SIG, but it's a completely separate organization. So you don't have to be part of the NMRA to join, although that's a great idea too. The LDSIG is its own organization and has a separate membership, which entitles you to the magazine, which I think is good. And
you're not biased, though.
Not at all. Not at all. It's completely objective.
We should also mention, because someone watching might be going, what in the world is SIG supposed to mean? It's Special Interest Group.
Yes, good point.
So there's a layout design special interest group, just as there is an operations special interest group. And these are sort of, I don't know what you'd call it, specialized people that are interested in these specialized things. And a lot of the people are...
John, I'm the NMRA SIG program coordinator, and having been the president of LDSIG and a director of OpSIG for a long time, the SIG program is to give people who have particular specialized interests, hence the name, an opportunity to form groups that operate under the umbrella of the NMRA. And that gets them a number of benefits, mostly participation in NMRA national conventions as organizations. And we have a number of facilities, including SIG meeting rooms and clinic tracks and so forth to support them. So as a practical matter, that's the main thing that the SIGs get. And the major SIGs are LD and OP in terms of largest number of people, but there's a Civil War history group, people who model Civil War railroads, a steel mill group. Again, that plays into operations because, steel mills are very complex and interesting subjects to model if you have the space. And also we've got a group. Say again?
Go ahead, Seth. I'm sorry. I was just going to say there's an S-scale SIG that's smaller but pretty active.
Yeah, and then a number of the major railroad historical societies also have a SIG existence also, and mostly that's that they can hold mini meets within the NMRA convention, and it's very simple, easy. If you've got a group that's interested in something, please contact me offline, and I'll explain what the process is. So, anyway, SIGs are good.
It's definitely a way to get more specific information, right? Because NMRA has a lot of information about layouts, layout design, standards, and all that stuff. But I don't know that the NMRA has specifically something for people to, like the meet that's happening next weekend, where someone can take, well, I guess I don't know how we're doing it virtually, but where someone can take their layout space that they have, all their assets that they have available to them, to someone like Byron, who's design, it's his business. I mean, this is what he does, right? And you can get him to tell you some ideas about it, give you feedback for basically what is the cost of the admission, right? I mean, it's hard to get better than that.
Yeah, the LDSIG meet this year, usually we do the layout design help sessions during the main meeting. This year, because we're not meeting in person, and because we have so many people looking for help, we're actually doing them asynchronously with the meet, so that some of them have already started and they will continue even after the meet. But you need to sign up for it. I think John and Sydney put the link on the page for this session, so you can click through there and join join the meet, and that will be completely online Saturday and Sunday next weekend.
Yeah, I think the link is in the video's description below, all that text where I type in what we're talking about. I have a question or sort of a comment about layout design, and I want to go to you, Jack, because you did something, and you've made the point a number of times on the series that we do together on the channel here, that you can take all the guesswork out of your track plans by using what the prototype had. And sort of in addition to that, if you're doing a proto-freelance or proto-lance, whatever you want to call it, you can still take actual track plans that worked in the real world for these railroads and apply them to your make-believe railroad too. I mean, you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I've always thought that's a very simple but very profound thing to take away from something like this.
When Brian was talking, I was thinking, what if I did not have the information I had when I started designing my layout? I had track plans with all the major yards and so forth. So that's what I built. I might take off a couple sidings, but the essence was still there. And it worked for the railroad. So there are no switching puzzles. You don't have a situation where people start, they stand there when the operations session starts, and you don't see people standing there staring at stuff thinking, how am I going to get those cars out of there? It's obvious. It doesn't have to be hard or frustrating. One yard it's the only one that causes people to think, is because you have to leave the yard and then turn on a Y. So you have to build your train backwards and back into the Y and take off. But that yard is just like the prototype. And in fact, when I was able to expand my layout, I don't know, several decades ago, because I originally had a shop in the garage also. When the last kid moved out, my wife said, why don't we take your shop, put it in the bedroom so they can't move back in. And it worked. So I used that to rebuild what I had as the El Portel was just a main line and one a spur, I think. So I actually took my space, laid it out, in a plan, took the prototype drawing, laid it over it, cut out pieces of straight track, put it all together, so every single switch is there. It's just the passing tracks or run around tracks are not as long as they were. So there's no reason you can't take a yard on a railroad if you're going to model a fictitious railroad that hauled coal, then why not take a yard out of a coal hauling railroad, because it worked for them and it would work for you.
Yeah, I think the one caution there is just you need to understand what the real railroad was doing, because you could this is called layout design elements, and taking chunks of real railroads. Tony Custer came up with that phrase, and I think it's just you just have to be a little careful about putting things together that, you can put the transmission from a Corvette and the rear end from a Ford F-150 together. Both are real cars, but that's not going to work so well. Rob, what did you do when you're designing yours? Because you had there's some real life elements, but you had to do a lot of extension to that.
Well, what I did to create the concept here, Byron, is I looked at various prototype elements from the Western Pacific and railroads that it interchanged with. And for example, the major yard of the railroad is heavily based on the WP division point at Portola with some elements of Oroville thrown in. So I found resources in books to go to the question that someone asked there on the screen. How do you find out about this stuff? Try to find books on your prototype, websites about that prototype, any photos that you can find online, find magazines from historical societies. So I started looking at all of that information to see what would work it on the real railroad, and then what would fit my space, where I would have to shrink it. And I also read about what trains the railroad ran so that I could design to fit those, because I knew I couldn't fit like an entire Portola yard in here. I don't have the space. But if I understand how that yard functions by reading about the trains that work there, I can create a yard that works for that function. So those are the types of things that I would do to create something that's fictitious but believable. It's based on function.
Yeah, I think the question, as an operator, now this isn't necessarily true for all layouts, and
no,
but for operating layouts, think of operations really as modeling the jobs of the railroad, right? So, those, like anything else you model, are going to be selectively compressed because you can't fit everybody who worked in the real railroad in your basement or your garage. But you do find some signature elements that tell the story you're trying to tell, going back up to the conceptual level. So, Rob and I both went through the process of saying, well, we like these particular jobs. We have particular industries we want to serve. Rob has a job called Raft River, which goes down and works a paper mill and paper mill or lumber mill.
It's a sawmill, plywood mill.
Sawmill. Okay. So, and I have an auto plant. So we both needed to think about, well, what kind of operations go with that sort of industry, and what would that train look like? What kind of cars would it have? What kind of schedule would it? Is it just in time, or do you just bring a bunch of logs down and let them sit until the mill's ready for them? And then based on that, you back into, well, what's that train going to look like? What kind of yard do you need to have in that train? And from that, you start to build up an operating plan. So again, you're looking at prototype practice, as Jack has long pointed out, if you're a prototype modeler, you can be a little lazy because all you need to do is figure out what your prototype did. Guys like Rob need to think about it a little bit more to make sure it's still plausible, but it's essentially the same process.
One other thing I just recommend in just a general way, and we'll see if you guys agree. I think still the John Armstrong book, Track Planning for Realistic Operation, even though the later editions I don't like as much as the early editions, but I think there's just a lot of information there about how generically real railroads worked, blocking and industry tracks and general yard function. I think there's a lot there that is a good foundation for people to understand, so then they can go to these more specifics. And one thing I would add, Rob had a great list of resources, but I think many railroads have historical societies, and there may be information online or in their publications that's really useful as well.
Yeah, I think I'm going to drag you guys all back to kind of the idea of general planning for a layout here. And I want to go back to that question that I ask people that would like me to try to design a layout for them. I would ask the question, what do you want? What do you want out of the layout? And I wrote up a short list of items to consider. Time period. What time period do you want to use? Are you talking about contemporary stuff right now? Or are you talking about what, like John said, the Civil War era? Equipment. What kind of equipment do you want to use? Again, this kind of all fits in with the time period as well. But are you wanting to use 85-foot passenger cars and 89-foot flat cars? Well, that might be great, but it'll have to see how well it works with what do you have to work with thing, which is space. Another thing would be, what kind of scenery do you want to have? What part of the country you might want to have? Do you want mountainous terrain? Do you want desert? Do you want flat rolling fields of corn? Industries. What kind of industries do you want to have? It's just like Byron and Jack and Ron were speaking. What kind of industries do you plan on having? Are you going to have an oil refinery and a which obviously takes huge amounts of space? Or are you looking for more like a sawmill or maybe a cement distribution plant or something like that? Another item that you would consider is, are you going to be freelance or are you going to be prototype? Because it makes a difference as to how you're going to go about doing your research in order to get what you want. Once you get what you want, then you get to ask, well, what do I have to work with? And that kind of boils down, in my mind, to three major things: time, space, and money. What do you got available to you that you can work with? And now take a look back at all those other items I just listed off and see what you can actually accomplish of the what I want, and how well does it fit into the what do I have to work with.
And to add on to his comment, I think something that's important for new people is that they don't always know what they really want. And sometimes a newbie mistake is to think that, well, the less prototypical my planning is, the easier it will be because I'm not, rivet counting something. And really the inverse is true, because the more the prototype supplies an answer for you, the more information you can find that will exactly match that answer. The more you're just doing your own thing, the easier it is to just wander off into land of repeating the same old mistakes over and over again, because you just don't have a guideline. So trying to focus yourself on some part of the real world that you really like is a really good idea for beginners, maybe more so than they realize.
Yeah, that's very true. I noticed a question that Sydney had up on the screen about which edition of Armstrong's Track Planning for Realistic Operation do I recommend. I'll just I don't want to say that the third edition, which I think is the current one, is bad. It's just they plugged in a lot of stuff about modern railroading that I think kind of breaks up the flow and took some pages away from some things. If you're interested in the transition era or early diesel era, kind of when the book was written, then I think the first or the second editions are more of a piece. I feel like they're more what Armstrong intended. Now, I may just be, that may just be sentimentalness on my part, sentimentality. I understand that Kalmbach is publishing a new layout design book, sort of to take the place of track planning for realistic operation in the near future. I don't know the details, but so we'll see what that's about. So the third edition is fine if that's what you can find, but the earlier editions, which are available used, I think hold together a little better, but don't have the information about modern railroading that some people might need.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Rob's comments there that if you're a beginner, I would strongly recommend you go find somebody who's already done it, like a model railroad club or somebody who already has a layout, and see if you can't participate in some of the things that they do there. That'll give you a pretty good idea of what's it all about. What do you think you can accomplish or actually be a part of in something like that? It really helps to find some mentors, is what I would say.
Yeah, I think extending that theme a little bit, if you think you might be interested in operation, go and operate on as many different layouts as you can. Obviously, it's going to be a little tough in the next year or two, but as things loosen up a little bit, I had started planning before I became a serious operator, and happily life and career had intervened, and I wasn't actually getting anything built, because at the point that Byron came over and gave me a big kick in the butt, and we started building some bench work, I had developed some experience and had developed some opinions about what I wanted based on what I had learned on a number of other layouts. So I had a good idea of what I enjoyed and didn't enjoy as an operator, and had been really able to firm up the concept of what story I was trying to tell, what jobs I wanted to model, what style of operation I liked. And once I had done that, fitting everything into the room and doing the detail was much less of a problem. It was much more, at that point, goal-oriented. It was pretty clear where I wanted to get to. And, I was fortunate I had the size of the room and resources to just go build it, and obviously had some very, very good advice locally on doing it. So, you can't, I think, spend too much time at the conceptual and structural level and really figuring out what you're trying to do. The rest of it, I wouldn't say it takes care of itself, but it becomes fairly mechanical.
Yeah, I saw something go by in the comments asking about the Layout Design Journal issue number 7, which is the yards issue, if that's still available. And yes, that is available as a back issue from LDSIG.org. And the other book I would recommend, although it's out of print, is Andy Sperandio's yard book. Really excellent. It's a shame it's out of print, but I think that's a really good one also. And then the question that was up before that was about what's the biggest problem. I don't know if Sydney, if you can put that up again, but what's the biggest problem you've found in designing a layout for oneself or others? And I'll leave it to you guys to answer first, because I've got a lot of stories there, and I don't want to take too much time.
I think in the general answer to that question is basically trying to get people's expectations and desires for a layout in line with what they actually have to work with.
Yeah,
I think for me, it's trying to help somebody who doesn't know what he wants, and so they bring in, well, I want to build a railroad in this space, and I really love trains. Okay, well, what do you want it to do? I have no idea, and then you have nothing to work with. You don't know what bench work to put up. You don't know what type of a curvature to ask for. You got nothing. So trying to help somebody that's really unfocused, that's very difficult for me.
Yeah. Just to answer to that second part of that question there, what creative solutions have you seen? One of the things that I've seen in design for multi-level layouts is, how do I connect one level to the next? And some of the creative designs I've seen, at least in my view, is that you don't have to have the levels connected. They can be two separate levels. Jim Diaz's Western Pacific Railroad comes to mind. He hails an op session and he has two separate levels, but it's just basically the Western Pacific. Another design, and I can't remember where I saw it. Maybe one of you other panelists know where it was, but somebody actually has an elevator where they park the whole train in the elevator and it lifts up to the second level and allows the train to approach the level that way, as opposed to the two standard means of level change, which is a helix or a long run for a large grade. But those are the two ones that come to mind for that question.
Cassettes also, either just as storage cassettes that can be moved physically. Car ferries, another way to do that. I'd be very, very cautious about the elevators. Of all the layouts I've ever operated on, there's only one that I thought was really reliable. There's just a lot of trouble with keeping things aligned at the ends. It's sort of okay if you go off straight, but if you have to trail back onto it for some reason, a lot of them really fall down on that. And I mean literally fall down. Cars falling off the layout. So, if you're very good mechanically, it's wonderful. But
I'll bet there's a prototype for that.
Thinking out of the box is valid.
Well, when I did my helix, I did a one-turn helix, and then there's a hidden climbing section. And I think it's the best solution, but the problem is your train is out of view for about 2 minutes. Fortunately, sound helps. You can hear it. Before you had sound in my helix, I actually put a door viewer where you can look through it, look out and see who's outside before they had electronics. And because you would get in the helix and people didn't know if the train was still running. And so you could look through this little door thing and see it in there. I wished I'd not had to do that, but the alternative, which is what I think I started out designing, was that climbing section was going to be over the major yard on the layout. And to me, that was unacceptable. It destroys the feeling that you're actually running a train or building up a train, and here's another train going right across the sunset in front of you. So I think Tony Custer's idea, he had the room where you just continually climb and climb and climb, but we don't have basements that big in California. We have no basements in our town at all. We're too close to salt water. So it's not an option, but I know the fellow that had the lifting thing. He was in our little round robin club for a long time until he moved. It seemed like it worked. What he needed to do was he was modeling a very, very small railroad, and it was going to be 440s, that kind of thing, without much pulling power. So he could not put a long, steep grade in without cutting back to 3 cars. So he went in, he could have a 10-car train. It came up, went out on the next level. So neither level had grades on them. So it's a compromise. But
I just want to jump in with one quick thing on to add to Mark's point. I have designed now several layouts for folks that are not connected. The two decks are not connected physically, but you connect them with staging and operations. So a train headed for the branch runs into staging on one deck, and a similar, not identical train emerges from staging on the branch deck. And if you are careful with how you assign crews, it works very well. You don't have to take up floor space with the helix. You don't have to, have a lot of space for a run around the room. A lot of people are very hesitant about it, but it does work, and the people I've designed it for are happy with it. I had to talk them into it, but it worked. And then just to answer the original question, what's the major challenge you have? I think over and over again, it's always the same. It's a variation on the same challenge, which is 10 pounds of sugar in a 5-pound sack. Everybody wants too much, and you just have to really then distill what is the key thing you want to see. That goes back to the concept. What is the most important thing? And then let's take the most important thing you want to see, whether that's a town or a kind of operation or a specific train. Let's take that most important thing and build out as much as we can to fit and stop before we wreck the thing by packing it too full.
One thing I might add is one of the design elements I had was once I knew what kind of grade I was going to have in the helix, then I could figure out what's the longest train I can have in that helix. That set the size of all the passing tracks. So I don't have a passing track that's 10 feet long. I have a passing track for a 5-car train with a caboose and an engine.
Right.
And so I don't have that issue of the caboose being in one town and the engines in the next town, because I was able to separate them.
Yeah, we talk about...
I'm sorry. You want to go ahead, Byron? Or
yeah, I was just going to say, we talk about, I think I heard Don Mitchell use it first, but the concept of lineals, which is to take your target train length and kind of use that as a yardstick all over the layout. Like how big is staging, how big are passing tracks, etc. What are the, and then you just move that around the layout. So Jack, what was the biggest challenge you had? Was it getting between the decks, or what would you say is the biggest challenge in the design?
No one else had done it yet. I always forget his name. There was an associate editor of Model Railroader about the same time that he started his layout double deck about maybe a month or two before I did. Pardon?
Hediger. Jimmy Hediger?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And there had been plans drawn for it, but plans don't prove that the idea works. And so what I did is, one of the things we were going to talk about, or possibly talk about, is doing a test layout first. And I did that because I wanted to perfect my track laying ability, my scene reconstruction. Did I want spline roadbed or plywood, those kinds of things. So I actually spent several years on that, and to the point where I thought, okay, now I think I've got my answers. Then I took a switch layout that I'd built, switching layout, hung it from the rafters over another yard, and looked at it for 2 weeks. Is it far enough apart, or is it too close? Is it too far and I'm wasting space? So that gave me that element. And so I actually did an article a couple of months after I started after I started my bench work, on how I built bench work, because there had not been a single article about how to build a double deck layout. How do you support the upper deck, so forth. So I enjoy those kinds of things. So I'm not complaining. That's what engineers do. We love challenges, and you solve the challenge. And when you get done, you say, wow, that was kind of neat. It all worked out just like I'd hoped. So that was what I was going through.
We did a video, actually. I should mention that if anyone's interested in hearing more about that, the layout ahead of time, and then the second layout as the layout, as it were, and all the challenges of the height and everything else that that's it's called multi-deck layout design, I think. Model railroading with Jack Burgess. That's one that's definitely worth looking at if you're considering building something like that yourself. I'm glad you brought that up, Jack, because if you guys don't mind, I wanted to throw out that idea, and I think it's a really, really important idea. Two things. One is to always make sure when you are planning that you don't have on your if it's a multi-deck, that you don't have on your upper deck a busy yard, and then on the lower deck another busy yard, because now you got 8 guys trying to fit into a very short or small space. And then the other one, which is one of the elements I think of your layout, Jack, that I'm always really impressed with when we're in there working on a video, which is how you also varied the depth so that people couldn't accidentally knock things off with their elbow or something like that, and had physical blocks so that you wouldn't have to end up repairing stuff all the time because someone did bent down to do something and their butt took half the layout out. And I always thought that was a really cool thing and really heady to come up with those solutions before that problem ended up happening to you.
You need to just get skinny little operators.
Yeah, speaking along those lines, speaking along the lines of trying to fit yourself to your layout, I'm going to bring up an element of design that people don't always like to talk about, but probably needs to be considered. I generally call it Medi-Cal design. And what I mean by that is that nobody that I know of gets any younger. And as you get older and older, you're going to find yourself less and less able to do things like go under duck unders or crawl underneath very narrow spaces of the layouts. And I've got Medicare knees, and I can get down on my knees, but trying to get back up again is another story. So, height would be a big deal for me. So that's something you really need to look at, is if you're going to be in your residence for a long time or wherever you're planning your layout, think about what's going to be like in the next 10 to 15 to 20 years of your life. Do you think you're going to be in as good a shape as you are? Are you going to be able to do the kinds of things that you're going to need to do for maintenance or re-railing cars or something like that? To use a worn-out phrase, it's going to become painfully obvious when that time comes and you put in a duck under that's only 3 feet high, and all of a sudden you can't get down 4 feet. You don't fit.
Well, there was a question that came up just now about what's the downsizes of modeling a prototype, and my first thought was nothing. Mark brings up a good point. I have a duck under. I try to get it as high as I can, or I could, and get it as narrow as I could. But one solution to there would have been put a bridge in, and so it drops down or lifts up. But what if there wasn't a bridge there on the prototype? Then what do you do? So there would be solutions. You could have a bridge that was not really a bridge, but just track and a little bit of scenery on each side that lifted up. I
think one thing to, and maybe Rob may be able to speak to this, but I think one of the reasons people design layouts that aren't purely prototypical is that they want some combination, of features or elements that didn't all exist in one place in a linear, string of pearls on some real prototype somewhere. So in order to get what they want in terms of a concept, you have to do some freelancing or completely freelancing. And some people enjoy that. Some people really enjoy making up their own thing, kind of from scratch. Rob, what was it for you that took you down the proto-freelancing road rather than pure prototypical?
Well, some of the things were that the parts of the prototype world that interest me operationally and scenically don't necessarily fit that well in a basement. I'm sitting here in a 1,000 square foot room, But if I'm modeling something like the WP between Salt Lake City and Elko, there's so much there that's so linear, you can't capture that in a room that well. And to try to create places where the track has to bend, or that maybe you have to have an elevation change where the prototype doesn't have an elevation change in order to fit the thing into the room, the more of those compromises that I have to introduce to actually make the railroad work in my space, the less I'm going to be happy with it, at least for me, if I'm thinking that, well, that's a prototype, but really there's so much there that I can't replicate that it's going to become bothersome to me. So if I then slightly adjust these things so that I can introduce that freelance element, the only thing that scene has to compare against is a typical prototype scene, and in which case, whatever compromises are inherent in where the track bends or how short you have to make a spur or something like that, it doesn't have a prototype that you can say, that's wrong. And, also to speak to that is a potential downside. It just depends on what bothers you.
Right.
There are plenty of people that can cram something into a small space and say, well, that's my prototype railroad. And even though it has a zillion compromises, they're perfectly okay with it. So it really depends on your own mindset of how much the compromise eats at you when you look at it every day as you're working on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we have a friend who models pieces of the Alaska, British Columbia, and the SP in Oregon. And again, he wanted to get all of these elements together. It has a branch, so it's not exactly Byron's string of pearls, but and then, of course, the motive power that he liked was not what any of them actually ran. So, then, and further, one of them had what he felt was a very ugly paint scheme. So in order to resolve all those issues, he actually built a meticulously researched railroad that runs very nicely, operates very nicely. But there was a tremendous amount of work in figuring out what those things were and blending them together so that they worked believably to people who had some idea of how railroads worked. So it can be done, and it's certainly, not a lesser railroad. I mean, I'm kind of in awe of it because I don't think I could have done that myself, but he is one of our local go-to guys for prototype information, and he was able to pull that off. But that may really be extra for experts, not for everybody to try.
Yeah, I think, go ahead, Mark.
I was just noticing the question that's on the screen, and also the comments following it about bench work height. Yeah, you do want to consider bench work height. In fact, it kind of falls in line with what I was mentioning earlier about considerations for the future you and perhaps others. I mean, if you find yourself liking to have a railfan's view of your layout, which means you're going to have a fairly tall bench work, that's great until sometime in the future you find yourself maybe in a wheelchair or something like that. Then it's not so wonderful. You can't see it. In that case, perhaps maybe you want to consider a modular setup where you can adjust the height of the legs. The last podcast I was in, it was basically talking about modular design, and this was one of the issues that came up was what's the height, and several of the folks on there were Fremo people. They were from the Fremo group, and that's an organization that is basically a modular based organization for get-togethers and setting up modulars. But you can make your layout a series of modules, and that does a couple of things for you. Number one, you can make it higher or lower if you put it on legs that do so. And the other thing that it can do for you is that if you decide you get tired of a scene, or you decide you want to improve a scene, you might be able to just switch out the particular module, rather than having to tear into the bench work and cut up the L girders and everything in order to get something new.
Yeah, I think, in terms of benchwork height, it's really individual. And if you think about what Jack talked about doing in setting up a mock-up, doesn't even have to be a real piece of layout. It can be made out of cardboard or something. And try that out. For me, I've discovered over time that kind of the elevation of my bent elbow, just the elevation of my elbow, is a nice level for operating. I just, that's comfortable for me. Other people like it higher or lower, and so it's very it's a very individual matter of personal preference. And I see the question on the screen right now is, have you ever given design advice for a modular club? I can say I have. They didn't follow all of it, but that's not necessarily important now. So
you don't sound bitter at all, Byron.
I'm not. No, actually, I'm not. It's like you send these things out into the world, and then they become whatever they become, whatever botched, ugly mess. I mean, whatever direction it goes. So I have, and I think one of the key things about modules for this group, and again, this is one of those things where concepts vary. For some people, they want to build a thing that will allow as many different people to come in and do something as possible. So they have not very many constraints on what the scenes are like, or the transition from scene to scene, or even standards. Other people want to say, we want to have a concept. The way this modular group started out, they wanted to have a concept that people could build to. So to design a layout that was in discrete chunks, they weren't necessarily modules, they were sections, so they wouldn't necessarily go together the same in any way. So I designed the layout that you could cut into sections, and the idea was that people would come in and say, "Oh, I'd like to build that coal mine scene," and somebody else would say, "Oh, I'd like to build that town scene." In fact, that didn't work, but designing for modular construction really, again, comes back to the concept. And why is it modular? Or sectional? Is it sectional to have lots of different people build things? Is it sectional for future proofing a little bit, as Mark was talking about? Is it sectional for storage? Is it sectional for a display? All of those things will lead to different designs.
Yeah, I wanted to ask one more thing on benchwork height. I have another friend with an operating layout. Actually, he's built several operating layouts. He seems to tear them down every 4 or 5 years and build one even more spectacular than the one before. But what he had discovered was that his operators, as Mark points out, were not getting any younger, and they no longer wanted to stand on his Midwestern basement floor for 8 hours. So he's taken, on the last couple of go-rounds, to building essentially desktop height layouts that are around 30 inches more or less, draftsman stools with wheels on the bottom. And for most of your work on this layout, you can simply roll yourself around. Now, I'm not sure it's fully ADA compliant because there's still a staircase to get in or out, but from the perspective of your knees and heels not liking to stand for 6 hours or 8 hours, particularly in a place where maybe you can't put carpeting down because you occasionally have moisture problems and things like that. This turned out to be a great solution, and these are wonderful layouts. You've seen them in the major magazines, and probably said, "Wow, I could never build anything like that." So anyway, that's a really good approach. And then he, in fact, ended up double decking in some places, and you kind of have your choices of jobs. So if you don't feel like you can do an all-day job standing, there's plenty of alternatives where you don't have to.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a job like that here, Seth. That branch line operation that you were talking about earlier can be operated from a roll-around drafting chair. And that's one of the reasons why I like having that job on the railroad, is every so often somebody comes in and they've got an issue. Like we had a round robin operating group here for a while that was part of the NMRA division. And one of the guys that loved to operate couldn't operate on a lot of the railroads because he had to sit. He had problems with his legs. And so that job was perfect for him because he could do it the entire session long on a chair.
Well, that job is fantastic, whether or not it had that wonderful feature also. I mean, it's just a great job. So that's really super. I hadn't even thought about that, but you can.
One other thing I want to add about multi-level layout and height and such is that when you decide the distance between your levels, make sure you can get underneath the top level and be able to do your maintenance. I had a fellow who wanted to put in a triple deck layout, and I looked at the spaces in there. I said, well, I don't think that's such a great idea, and back and forth a little bit. So what I did was I built a mock-up, kind of like what Jack was saying, and I made it to the height that he seemed to think he wanted, and I put it together, and I said, okay, now stick your head under there and see if you can see what's underneath the bottom. Well, he made a double-decker layout instead of a triple letter. So be sure you can, and it goes for layout height too. Make sure you allow room for yourself to be able to get under and do your maintenance, because there's nothing more frustrating. And I can speak from experience with this at the Napa Model Railroad Club. Trying to roll around underneath there with wires and maybe even nail ends and everything else, trying to get to a problem that's buried behind a 2x6 or something like that, isn't fun. And model railroading needs to be fun.
Well, let me add a quick one. When I designed my layout, I was thinking about myself. And so the bottom level is, I think, 44 inches, which is really nice. You could say, put your elbow on. I have armrests, so you could sit there with your arm on it. And then I put the second deck so that you could see and so forth. And after I got started, I met my future wife. And several years later, when I was doing scenery on the second level and so forth, I had a little stool, maybe an 8-inch stool in there. And for the very first time, she stood on the stool and says, "Oh, I've never seen this section before." So I still have a stool because I have open houses. And if I see somebody, it's a little too short to see what's on the upper level, I'll offer them the stool, let them see around. So it is a consideration. I missed it totally. But that's what happens when you're out there in front.
Well,
go ahead.
I just was going to say, I think the challenge with any multi-deck is that it's always a compromise to get enough separation between the decks. John Armstrong once said, one's going to be too high, one's going to be too low. And I think that's true. And so, one of the things I like to do when I can in a design for someone is to have some really quiet areas where either the upper deck or the lower deck is just passing through. And then even if you can't change the layout height in that, the layout elevation, you can put in a drop-down step. If only one level is going to be working there, you can set a drop-down step or even a permanent platform and make that area a better elevation. I think one of the things that I think Sydney commented earlier in the comments was about varying the compression in different parts of the layout. And that's certainly, I think, true. I like to think of it even more as varying the fidelity. Some scenes you're going to have, you really want to do a great job of making it very realistic, and you're going to maybe dedicate a little more space to that. Other scenes are just pass-through scenes or places you don't want people to stop in the aisle, so you make that much less detailed. So it's a matter of modulating the benchwork width, modulating the walkway width. You're welcome, Mark Stafford. Modulating the illumination. Very good. You don't want to set some decision somewhere and carry it all throughout the layout and say, I'm using 2-foot aisles, I'm using 3-foot aisles, I'm using 18-inch benchwork, whatever it is. Letting that modulate, letting things vary, really lets you focus on different parts of the layout to different degrees.
Jack did a really good job of that.
To add to this and to answer a question that was asked earlier that I don't think anybody addressed, I'd like to add it to Byron's comments here. Someone was talking about small railroads and open space earlier. That was one of the questions. And to go along with what Byron said, I think any time that you have the ability to add open space, do it. It's very easy to make a railroad, especially a small railroad, just totally crowded, and your eye has no place to rest. It's just busy everywhere. And I really like having scenes full of nothing. So whenever you have the ability to put just some sort of a visual respite in your layout, you'll not regret doing that. You may regret cramming another structure or another track in there, but you're not going to regret just a really nice open scene.
Totally agree. And I think that's the balance between modeling things that are unique and have the personality that you want to communicate, and modeling typicality. The most of the North American rail network is single track with no industries. It's just out in the middle of nowhere. And so being able to have those quiet areas, as Rob is talking about, between the scenes with more personality, I think really gives the eye a rest, lets you manage the aisles better, lets you manage where the people are better. I think there's just so many benefits, but it's hard to convince, in my experience, it's hard to convince people to set aside layout space to nothing, even though it's very, very important.
I saw an earlier question here about asking about how we go about. Let's see if I can find it here. Basically, asking about how we approach our electrical design of the layout, and that is a kind of a major consideration. And what you're going to do, it isn't a layout design consideration. I'd say first of all, you probably need to decide what kind of operation system you're going to use. There's still people that want to do DC. That's fine. But most people are moving to DCC, and that's going to make a difference as to how you block your layout. Do you want signals? I mean, if you're going to use signals, then that's going to make a difference too as to how you electrically block your layout. Other things that you are going to have to consider is how much, again, it comes down to how much money do you got to spend on what kind of electrical system you're going to use. And one of the things I want to say to everybody here before I forget about it, please, if you don't know how to deal with home wiring, electrical wiring, hire a professional to do it. They know the codes and they know how to do it safely. Don't end up making yourself a nice illuminated ornament for Christmas by trying to do your own homegrown wiring.
Yeah, and I think one thing I would just add, I'm certainly, how you divide a layout up into blocks or power districts or whatever is really dependent on the layout itself. But I think one thing that's important to recognize is that you're with DCC especially, you're really figuring it out based on locomotives, not on distance. Sound locomotives draw more power. Older locomotives can draw more power. So really, as you're dividing things up, think about where you're going to have locomotives active on the track, rather than just, I'm going to divide it up 20 feet, 40 feet, 20 feet. You really got to think about where that load is going to be. And Seth certainly could speak more to that, I think.
Well, I was just going to add, I try to break power districts up, sometimes using circuit breakers, which are a great tool, much less expensive than boosters, so that each place where people are working is independent of every other place.
Yeah, that's good too.
So, if you short something out, you don't bother your neighbor across the aisle. And again, it's another operating issue, but it's true even for display layouts. You'd like to isolate areas so that you can, have your own space and not be affected by problems elsewhere on the layout, and that really helps with troubleshooting and so forth. But I'm going to agree with Byron once again that it's really a question of, once we understand where the various work areas are on the layout, then we can start figuring out where to distribute power. There's trade-offs between distance and number of units, DCC, feed lengths, wire gauge, whole bunch of issues like that. So, but I think that's more at the detail planning level. It generally doesn't speak to you at the conceptual or structural level.
Agree.
Yeah, the issue of electrical probably could use a guest panel on all to itself. It's really big. It's a really big area to try to tackle, but it is part of the design layout, so it is an element of it. So it's good that it got brought up here.
Oh yeah, and it's strongly informed by the concept of standard train length or lineal. Anyway, these are all things you need to know before you start placing wires.
You guys see the question that came up there?
What is the craziest or weirdest? Oh,
I'm going to add. I want to add something to this question, if I could, guys. It might make it a little easier, and that is maybe the worst element of design that you've seen that was just a complete pain that never should have happened. I think of crawl unders and stuff like that as very things to be avoided at all costs, if you will. I
don't know how to say this and change the names to protect the
Yeah, that's the problem.
I was just thinking the same thing, Seth. We're for mine.
Well, I'll do one that's. Have I ever mentioned to you guys the modular layout that got botched? I probably mentioned that.
Yeah, you did. I think we heard something about that.
Yeah.
My apologies. I didn't mean to
Yeah.
Tell us.
It's an ugly memory.
Joe Smith in Nebraska has the worst crawl under I've ever seen.
I think there's some general things.
I'll give you that.
I think there's some general things that could be added to that I've seen as far as what John is referring to. There are some design elements that you definitely want. It tells you to avoid doing. For instance, the biggest one is putting turnouts underneath someplace that you can't access them from the top or bottom, for that matter. I've seen a layout that has an entire yard buried underneath it in layers of other layers, and I asked the gentleman how he had constructed it. He built the yard first, and he built everything else over the top of it. And what happens when your switch dies or something like that? Oh, I just stopped using the track. Yeah, that's not my idea of a good design.
It's pragmatic, though.
Unmaintainable switches, I think, is definitely
yeah.
Well, on the positive side, the coolest, some of the cooler things I've done are things that are pretty freelanced. I designed a layout based on Warner Brothers cartoons, with the duck season, rabbit season gag, and a bunch of other kind of jokes. And that was really fun. I've also designed a Discworld layout. There's a Discworld as a science fiction novel series, and there's one book that is heavily based on trains. And I've done a Lord of the Rings design. And each of those was really fun because you were telling a story that was not anything like North American railroading. You were telling a story with animation or with scenery, or with, in the case of the Lord of the Rings, you're telling the story in a sequence that matches the book. And those things are very different from traditional model railroading, but pretty cool.
Yeah, I think the weirdest thing, well, it's not weirdest, but I put it in the weirdest, most creative thing that I saw designed in a layout. I don't know if I would, well, anyway, it was at the NMRA National Convention held here in Sacramento a while back, and it was a modular layout, and one of the modules had a tornado scene.
Yeah.
And he actually had a little spinning tornado come down, go across the plane area, and then lift back up again.
Yeah.
And I thought,
there's some cool novelty modules. It was an N-track module. It was pretty neat.
Yeah.
I think I remember seeing that one too, Mark, or a tornado scene. I think they show up on the modular groups at the train shows usually.
Yeah, that's the only time I've ever seen it, so I don't know where it came from.
Someone made a funny comment that really relates to the whole thing about what space you're building in. It's a Possum Bayou there, said the layout he was trying to build in a room with 3 doors and a closet needed 3 lift outs, so he just built it in a different room. Right? That's kind of what I was getting at with my loaded question that wasn't intentionally loaded about poor design elements that you would avoid. Maybe that would be a better way to put it. What element or layout design elements would you avoid if you have to build something?
I think access and reach, as Mark and others have talked about, is really the issue. People say, "Oh, I can reach 4 feet." Yeah, you can.
Yeah,
but for now. But once you either get stiffer or you put scenery at the front edge of the layout, you're going to crush it when you reach over that far. So, reach and access is always important. And one of my pet peeves is that a lot of published speculative layouts, where somebody draws a layout and a commercial magazine publishes it, are basically impossible to build. You can't reach them. You couldn't build them. The grades are too steep. There's no vertical transition from level to grade. And it's a shame because people then think they can build that layout in the same space, or usually less space. And it's impossible. And I think that's doing a disservice. I understand that editors are busy and they don't want to have to tell somebody, "Oh, your layout design sucks." I heard of a modular layout. That's a different. But I really do, seriously, I just think it's a shame that there's not more care taken with published layouts, and really access and reach is one of the major areas where they fail.
Well, there was a question earlier There's a question earlier about, was there any downsides to prototype modeling? And to me, the way I approach the hobby, there is none. I mean, I love research. I love all these things. The downside could be for someone is they really get into their prototype and suddenly they can't find any building kits that match what they need. Or they said, okay, I'm going to go do this. And then several years later, their skills improve, and I've got to tear that building out because it wasn't right the first time, and it has to be right. So I've done that. I've replaced several buildings on my layout. But maybe it should be a warning if you want to be a prototype modeler that you need to maybe recognize that you're going to have to make some compromises to finish it. If you say, I got to scratch build every single building then, and I'm not going to live long enough to do that.
Right.
So it's something you need to recognize.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point, Jack. I mean, you do have to decide at some point. You have to be committed too, right? I mean, like, for example, on your layout, you were committed to build every single structure accurately, right? And the equipment as well. And if someone's not going to have that level of equipment, they need to make that decision, or that level of scratch building. They need to make that decision. I think it would be smarter to make that decision earlier on.
Yep.
So that they can just say, look, I'm just going to do a proto lance or just a fantasy thing. But that doesn't mean you can't still include some elements from prototype example.
And I have no idea what kind of kits are out there. When I see the ads, a lot of them look like they're back east and they're fantasy buildings, but maybe it's possible to pick a prototype that is so popular that there are kits out there, and there are kits for all the freight cars you need. So you don't need to scratch build cars or change the stuff on the layout.
Yeah, and I think an important point on this is everyone has to decide their own standard of excellence. What's good enough for me is certainly not good enough for Jack, and that's great. I mean, Jack is modeling museum quality, and I think that everyone has to decide where on that spectrum they land. Is what comes out of the Walters catalog good enough, and I'll work with it, bash it maybe a little, or will I never be satisfied with it? I think maybe Rob mentioned that at some point about just not being satisfied with some trade-off decision that you've made. So one has to really know themselves to make that decision, I think.
Yep.
I think your standards can evolve over time also.
True.
We challenge ourselves now. Some of us want to build everything ourselves, and that's, great if you've got the time and the skills to do it. I started off really wanting to operate, and my initial thought was just to have something that was one step better than the foam core mock-up with the name of the industry scrawled on it. And so I did start with the Walters catalog, or Rick's, in 1999, so that stuff is about right. I actually found that it wasn't very hard to modify a lot of them into, not just good enough, but fairly close. And, in the process of doing that, I was, fortunate to meet some very good builders who, really challenged me to up my game, and, just ended up building some buildings themselves. So, the end result, it's not the Yosemite Valley, but it's not bad either. And a lot of the buildings are quite recognizable. And that's important, not just because it's great to have a good model, which is fantastic. And, for many people, that's probably the major part of the hobby. But if you have a proper building that is built the way a prototype building is built, that's sends powerful messages to your operators about what they ought to be doing when their train gets there. So, it certainly helps with documentation because, they've seen that industry before and they generally know what you're supposed to do when you get there. Since they tend to be a little sloppy about reading the instructions, that's really helpful.
Yeah, I think Rob is a great example of using another thing that I think is important, which is big industries wherever you can. Rob has a few really major industries that set the scene, their signatures, they're big enough, they look right, they're painted the right colors. And did you start off with that idea, Rob, or how did you come to doing that?
Well, in looking at the prototypes that I like from the railroads I model here in the West, it's fewer but larger industries. To go back to our branch line here that Seth and I were talking about earlier, the sawmill here, it's 14 feet long, and the lead tracks that go into it are probably double that. And it's based on looking at prototype industries. That my dad grew up in part of Oregon where there was this monster sawmill just up the road from him. And I really liked the idea of having a huge industry like that. So I ended up designing something intentionally to be big and plain to kind of fit that bill. And it's taken a lot of years to get to the point where I have all the buildings and stuff in the thing. But other industries around the railroad that are smaller than that were still intended to be big because that's what I remember seeing on the prototype. Very little of the operation that I've ever witnessed, in my formative years of rail fanning, was switching like 1 or 2 car spur. I mean, there were a few of those. My hometown had a 1-car spur that served a lumber yard, but most of the things are big industries. So it was always part of the design to limit the number but make them bigger.
Yeah. I wanted to just, if it's okay, John, I wanted to just catch a couple of questions that came through, and I'll do the second one first. Somebody posted, what can I do to model a 30-mile short line in 10 feet? I don't know if that's a joke or not, but I think that the key issue here is really deciding what element of that. Obviously, in 10 feet, you're not going to do the whole thing. What do you want what's the story you want to tell about that short line? Is it a specific industry? Is it a town with some recognizable buildings? Really distilling what you want to see, and what you want to, the story you want to tell, and then do that. And one of the things we talk a lot about selective compression, which is, if you have a bridge with 10 spans, build it 5 spans long or whatever. I like to think about compressive selection, which is where you pick a part of the prototype that isn't very big or isn't very busy, but is more modelgenic. Maybe there's a town with just one industry and a team track, and maybe that's a better town to choose than a town that has one of Rob's industries that would take 15 feet to accomplish. So, selecting a part of the prototype that still tells the story you want to tell, but is more compact, I think is important. But that's a real challenge. You're not going to put a 30-mile short line in 10 feet, even in N scale. The other question, did you guys anybody want to add to that?
I want to say something real quick. Yeah, I want to say something if it's okay, real quick. Well, a couple things. I definitely do want to get to your other part. We're coming up on 90 minutes, which is where we usually cut these things. And I know I mentioned this to a couple of you guys ahead of time, that if because layout design is a huge topic. If anybody has to go, it's quite fine. If you need to, it's okay. We'll continue the discussion. But if anybody else is willing and able to, we can extend this for another 30 minutes if you guys are okay with that. That's up to you. The one thing I do want to mention that's relevant to what you were talking about, Byron, if I may, is that one of the things that always makes a layout speak to me, especially if it's a prototypical layout that's modeling a place, and you talked about this, is having something that's recognizable. And a great example is whenever I'm at Seth's layout, I look at Niles Canyon, and I can say, I stood here and I filmed a train going over Farwell Bridge, or wherever it is. And that makes it much more real to me. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that's something that's worth people trying to include something like that. Even if you're doing a completely fantasy railroad, have something that's recognizable. I think that will draw people in. It may be something that's just special to you, and it will draw you in, right, as your own layout. But I think that's a cool thing to think about, and something that could be very important.
Absolutely. Yeah, the other question that I saw that I wanted to speak to is kind of related to the question we just talked about. What are some recommendations for modeling in HO in smaller spaces? Wow, nice, Sydney.
She's on top of it.
She is definitely. She read my mind. That must be spooky around the house, John.
Or dangerous.
You never know what you're going to find when you walk into a dark room around here.
Yeah. So again, I think the key thing is really to distill the story you're trying to tell, the concept, the image. Somebody made the point on the feed that the British make very nice small layouts based on a single industry or a single stub end terminal. They have a lot more stub end terminals that are really very modelgenic. But I think for smaller spaces in HO, I think the key thing is think about whether you want continuous running or not, because continuous running is a thing that's going to expand the depth of the bench work and the overall space you need for the return curves, or fill up the whole room. And the other thing is, again, this idea of compressive selection. Pick a scene, pick an area that maybe doesn't have huge buildings. That's a team track scene or a house track scene that can still have some of the elements, maybe a kind of a specific depot structure that's characteristic, or so on. And you can always represent things and not build them. An interchange track is a great thing to suggest a connection with another railroad, and it's just a track. You can have a track going behind a row of trees to represent a connection to a big industry, and you just move the cars in and out there without building the industry, or make the industry just a backdrop. So I don't mean to monopolize the conversation. What advice would you other guys have for HO in a small space?
Use of cassettes, a lot of building flats, backdrop buildings, using X's so that the crossing allows you to work from both ends, and you can have two sidings together and overlap the turnouts. Number 6 turnout in HO is a foot, so there are lots of tricks like that you can get more in. I mean, at some point, of course, it's just all track, and that may not be as satisfying aesthetically. But if you just want a switching layout, why not?
Well, think about what Tony Thompson did with his. I don't know if all of you guys have seen Tony Thompson's layout, but he fit a ton of stuff into a pretty small space. I think it's just a matter of picking what you want and just figuring out the details to make it work, right?
Yeah, and Tony's a great example where he's really got some very signature industries, some very typical things for the area that really communicate that Central Coast locale.
I'm just looking back on that earlier question about avoiding pitfalls in design. What are your some tips for working in smaller spaces with HO? And I noticed the user's name is Old Man Jammin' in a Minivan. And I'm kind of wondering if he's living the minivan life. And that would be an interesting proposition to try to design a layout that you carry around with you in a minivan, living out of a RV or anything else like that. My first thought is to go to the Enter Z scale.
I was going to say that, Mark. One of the things I noticed that nobody on the panel said if you're working in a small space, go to a smaller scale.
Well, that's not always an option for people. They may have a lot of equipment and so on. But yeah, a smaller scale is always an idea. I have designed a layout for a motorhome that went into the space. There was a bunk that folded down, and we used that as space for the layout. And it turned out pretty well, but not a minivan. I have no or an SUV. I haven't done.
Yeah,
the leveling arrangement for that might be tricky.
Yeah,
magnet traction.
Storage.
There's the comment that I thought would be the most logical reason not to go to a smaller scale. I just had to recently
lowering that N scale car the other day, so Apparently, you could see it.
Yeah, but I had on my visor the whole time when I was weathering. I was wearing this thing the whole time. It was hard.
One other thought that came to mind when you're dealing with smaller spaces, and this may or may not be something that is going to work for everybody, because it can be a little bit of a challenge to implement. But when you're doing yard design and you start looking at a ladder, those ladders take up a fair amount of space just into themselves, and you can actually gain some space by making the ladder a curved ladder instead of a straight ladder. In other words, the ladder tracks are all made of curved turnouts instead of straight turnouts. You can fit more in by doing that. Now, that can be a tricky proposition to do that, and a lot of times it involves having to actually have custom-made curved turnouts, but it's still an option in order to try to save some space.
The other thing you could do is
you move the ladder out into the blob, which is typically curved at the end. So that could get you a couple of feet.
The other thing is
something that looks great, but if you need the space, you need the space.
The other thing you do is use what's called a pinwheel ladder.
Yeah, exactly.
In the pinwheel ladder, the next turnout comes off the diverging leg, so it naturally curves, and you don't need any special turnouts, but you don't get as much of a curve as you would with a curved turnout. But you do get a curve in the ladder, which can be very, very space saving, and I use them a lot. They're not as common on the prototype because the HO scale switchman would have to, or switchwoman in the modern parlance, would have to walk across the ladder potentially, but it's a great space saving tool as well.
Yeah, in HO, the curved Pico 75s, which
those are
a little toy light, but they really save a lot of space. And if you're able to, say, bury them under pavement so you don't notice that, they work very nicely.
Yeah, the Code 83s work pretty well too. They're not nearly as space saving as the Code 75s, but the Code 83 Pico turnouts, I use them a lot. Great. They're great.
There's somebody else who's Microengineering, I believe, offers a whole system of turnouts that deals specifically with shortening up the amount of space that a yard ladder takes. And
I found those weren't as useful as I would have hoped. I mean, they do help a little, but just trimming turnouts, trimming standard turnouts works pretty well too. I think one of the things that really makes them nice is they are number 5s. And so that's, not every turnout manufacturer offers 5s. Pico does in the Code 83. And scale, there's the Atlas Code 55s. So that part's really good. But some of the rest of it, I'm not sure you don't get as much back as you would hope.
Yeah, but they do look pretty good compared to, say, Pico 75. So,
I would say for the, I'm sorry, Seth, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I was generally agreeing with Byron that I think the advantage may be that they're compact and they look pretty good. Not so much that they're much more compact than alternatives.
Yeah, I think that I only bring those microengineering up things up because it's a pre-made system ready to go. Yeah. If you're doing something like Byron suggested, you're going to gain more space that way, most certainly. Of course, you got to have the skill level to be able to do what he's saying, and being able to trim up everything and get it all to fit precisely.
Well, if it comes to that, I'd say, go buy yourself number 5 and number 6 fast tracks jig, and just realize the first couple are going to be scrap, and you should be able to have pretty serviceable turnouts in a couple of efforts.
Again, that's the suggestion is for people who can't don't have soldering skills or just their skill set is limited to being able to take pre-existing track and put it together.
something that's relevant to this turnout conversation, I think, is, Jack, you had this really cool idea that I'd never noticed anybody doing on their layout before, which was making the points longer. I thought that was a really cool trick.
Yeah, Tony Custer mentioned that. And we've gone full circle because I had the track planning book that we were talking about an hour ago, and he had who's the author?
John Armstrong.
Armstrong, yeah. He had a chart in there, and you would say, okay, I'm going to run 260s is my biggest locomotive. Therefore, you need a 22-inch radius curve and number 5 turnouts. Anything more than a number 5 turnout is a waste of space. So I did that, and I scratch built all my turnouts, of course. But they always look so stubby. And Tony Custer said, just put the points back a little further, and it'll look fine. And it does. It made a huge difference on the very last yard that I built. Unfortunately, that's what everybody sees first when they walk in. So they think the rest of them are all that way. So
I think when it comes to track information and turnout information, probably the very best basic book that I had found was the A Track Work Handbook by Paul Mallory. There's a lot of really good information in there. It might be a little dated now. I don't know if they've come out with a new edition or not, but it carries a lot of good information in dealing with basically laying down track work and especially making turnouts. That's
Look at this. Seth has a regular library there. He's got everything.
And he's doing nice spokes model work as well.
Yeah, he has to get the hand motion.
Yeah, you do need the full.
To get the Vanna in there, yeah.
Yeah, so
but these are great books. I mean, that's
Yeah.
really the point. Some great resources out there that have been mentioned, and links have been put up. So yeah, the answers are out there.
Yeah, I noticed that our friend Dave Falkenberg mentioned that the number 5 is way more forgiving than a number 4, and it's true. Number 5s are like my secret weapon. I use them a lot in designs. If you're dealing with like roughly a 28-inch radius curve minimum in HO, or just a freight yard, number 5s are just like, I sprinkle them in like sprinkles on a cupcake, and it's really a nice tool to have in the tool chest.
Yeah. Does anybody here know why we ended up with just number 4, 6s, and 8s to start with, and why number 5 or number 7s didn't make themselves more
well, of course,
known?
Atlas N scale went with 5s and 7s, and the Atlas HO number 4 is actually about a 4.5 if you measure it. So it's closer to a 22-inch radius. So they're actually handier than one might think. I have a whole someday. When we're not wasting other people's time, I'll tell you my whole theory of why 18-inch turned out to be the magic radius and number 4s and number 6s. It has to do with true scale. It's a big, crazy thing. I'm like that guy, and It's Always Sunday in Philadelphia with the chart, and all the different lines pointing to different things. So I some of it is just accidental. Some of it, I'll just say it real quick. A lot of it is because there was 036 in 3-rail O gauge. So you could fit an 036, which is the diameter, on a 4x8 sheet. And I think as the prefab HO scale curves came in, people thought, well, we'll go for 18-inch radius because that's close to the 36. It'll fit the same way on a 4x8 sheet. So, and there's a lot more weird, crazy ideas I have that we'll go into another time.
Somebody asked a question about weird and crazy earlier.
It's my specialty.
Feel free.
It's my specialty.
What
But-
weird
but
and
I
crazy
think, I
is?
think Byron is correct with the 5s. If you're in the 4-axle world, certainly first generation Jeeps and down, and 40 and 50 foot cars, which would be a great transition era urban switching layout. You can use that stuff. And that means you can get just a boatload of operation into two walls in a townhome, or someplace you might downsize to, and that really would work pretty well. So I wouldn't be trying to get my SD40s through there, certainly not my SD90s, but it works pretty well for small cars. And then the nice thing is, of course, you get more play value with 40-foot cars than you do with 60s, because there's three of them. So, you start doing a freight house or a dock or some sort of industry with shore spots, and there's just a tremendous amount of action in a very small space. And these are really good tools to get them. And you can do it without taking up a lot of space in a room that maybe isn't entirely dedicated to a model. So they're good tools.
I see in the comments there's somebody commenting about having enough space for operators to pass one another in the aisleways. And I'm reminded of I was at a WP, a Western Pacific Historical Society meet, and one of the presenters was presenting his layout design, and he had this just absolutely hilarious picture of why you design layouts with wider aisleways. And there were two guys back to back smiling at the camera with their paunches hanging out to show just exactly one of the reasons why you need to be careful about how you design your aisle widths. You really don't want any pinch points. And I had heard a story somewhere, and I don't remember, maybe it was the fella up here that had the South Shasta lines, that because he was holding public shows, the fire department came and inspected and told him he couldn't hold them there because, number one, something was wrong with the stairway. But the other thing was that his aisleways were too narrow. People couldn't pass in the case of a fire or something like that. It would be too crowded, a pinch point. So it's certainly an element of design consideration you're going to look at if you're going to design a layout. Be careful of how your aisleways are designed. Most certainly, if you've just got a situation where you've got two tracks that are just main lines and they're near one another on either side of the aisleway, you don't have to have it that wide. But if you've got a yard on one side and an industry or agency on the other side, you're going to have people standing there constantly working, and you want to be certain to have enough room so that they don't, bang each other's rear ends, and that anybody that needs to get by them can without having to force them to move out of the way.
Yeah, I have one spot that is up next to a yard, and for most of an operating session, it works fine. But toward the end of the session, and the solution would be to change the timetable. But toward the end of the operating session, one train comes in, does its work. The other train comes in from the same direction, does its work. There's sidings on both sides to fit them. And then a third train comes in from the other direction and has to do a saw-by. So you've got three operators in this dead-end thing, but no one has to throw a switch or anything. So it works out. And it's kind of neat to see. What I suggest is don't talk. Solve the problem yourself. Don't say, "Oh, am I clear? Can you throw that switch for me?" It's all taken care of. If you're all on time, it just works really nice. But I wish I had more space.
Does anybody not wish they had more space? I mean, it's an honest question. I mean, it sounds funny, but because think about it. If somebody had access to a massive warehouse, it would be so much work and so much pain in the to try to build and maintain and clean the track and all that stuff. I mean,
I have heard people.
Complex the railroad is, though.
Yeah, I have heard people lament the fact that maybe they built too large of a layout for just themselves to deal with, and it all boiled down to how much time you had to spend maintaining the track and the rest of the layout. That's the only time I've ever heard anybody say that that they might have too much space.
Well, I used to think.
I've heard people who have moved out to some fairly rural area with the theory that they would have enough room to build a huge outbuilding and no zoning, and they did, and then found that they had built too big a layout for the number of available operators. So, that's another possible trade-off.
Well, I thought,
and I tried to talk him out of it, Seth.
Yeah, I thought decades ago that it would be great to have enough space to model the YV foot for foot. Don't think about actually building it. But then I realized operation would be so boring. The major yard would be 20 feet long. It would take you 2 or 3 minutes just to do a runaround. So that made me think, okay, I think I've got enough space. Everything works out fine.
I think Rob started to make a good point earlier, which is complexity versus size and scope. Did you want to say any more about that, Rob?
Yeah, because a large operating layout like mine, it's not very complex. And so by myself, I'm able to maintain the thing because there's just not that much to it. But if I filled this same space up with nothing but like a steel mill, industrial railroad, that might be so complicated that I wouldn't be able to take care of it on my own. So, the size of the layout isn't necessarily the factor. If it's, if you got something that's 500 feet long, that's nothing but single track and a passing siding here and there, it might not be that bad to deal with. But,
right.
It all depends on how much you cram into the thing.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to the question that's on this, partly speaks to the question that's on the screen now, which is, how do you balance the operation versus the physical space for the operators to do it? And, I think you've really got to plan. I think Mark made the point. You've really got to plan for the operators. And, if it's a trade-off, you need the space for the operators. There's no point in having a ton of tricky trackage if everybody's miserable while they're working on it. And if you can't maintain it.
Yeah, there's a wonderful layout also in the Mountain West, which is quite large, and he did a wonderful job of getting some very recognizable scenes in. But he's got like 6 aisle peninsula pairs, and the 5-foot aisles really aren't wide enough for the 40-person crew he needs. And it's a beautiful layout, and I certainly wouldn't have attempted to do anything like that myself. But in hindsight, I would probably have gone with 1 less aisle peninsula and proportionally widened everything else. I think it would have breathed a little bit better. It'd be like choosing which child you love the best to figure out what you were going to leave out. But the layout I'm talking about from the...
I do.
I think I know which one you're talking about.
It has a lot of bridges, doesn't it?
Yeah,
not necessarily.
Not too many bridges. That's tunnels.
It's nice to not have to carry a can of Crisco to have to get between aisles when you're walking down the
This is a family show, Mark.
I think I speak for all of us when I say you.
Not my original joke.
I think it's interesting that Doug asked that question and about the balancing the space for the operators and so on. Doug's layout is actually a really great example of simple prototypical spaces that have nice wide aisles. So if you want to do it, Doug, do it like the way you've done it. You've done a fantastic job of incorporating recognizable prototype scenes and allowing space for people to move around to accomplish their work. So just keep doing what you're doing. You did fine.
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly breathe in there, and you can move around comfortably. There's a few places where you probably want to, get up a little bit higher to work, but it's quite good for, especially for a layout that size.
I think one of the things I find in designing layouts for other people is the most important thing I do is tell them no. No, we can't do that many towns. No, we can't do this many peninsulas, because people's desires are almost always larger than their space. It's certainly possible, to overbuild the layout and make it an unpleasant operating and maintenance experience. So, it's really a matter of prioritizing conceptual design, figuring out what stories you want to tell, and then, put in the minimum that tells that story.
That's an interesting approach, Byron. It's kind of the same thing that we do with video editing. You take stuff out that's unnecessary. If it doesn't enhance or improve the story, it gets on the, cut to the floor, and it makes for a much more concise presentation. And I never really thought about it that way, but I can see how those things apply. Really, it applies to a lot of things.
Yeah, and I think the other key that I try to suggest to people doesn't fit in every situation, but is to stage as much as you can rather than build it. Certainly, especially for yards. You may not want to build a giant division point yard if you have relatively small space. Let that yard be represented by staging, and then build other things that are more interesting, or more interesting for the space they use. Again, compressive selection, trying to pick the pieces that make the most, that tell your story best.
That was a struggle I had when I was designing my layout, because Tony Custer and people like that were advocating for staging. You've got to have staging on each end of the layout of the railroad. But they're modeling through railroads, and I'm modeling a dead-end railroad. And so I was trying to do what they were suggesting, at the same time recognizing it wasn't going to work for me. So I had one staging track at the top. So I said, I have staging. I've never, ever used it. I've ripped it out. And I had a loop to turn trains during an open house, and it has 2 tracks in there instead of 1. So, but I've never used it. So I think you've got to do is think of what you want to build. And if you're building a railroad that just goes from one place to another, then you don't need staging necessarily. You might need a place to store all of the cars, the thousands of cars you've bought or built. But staging is not prototype for every single prototype.
Right. Although, don't you have staging for the SP and Santa Fe interchange?
I never have used it.
Oh, really?
I was going to do that. And there were some jobs that I thought of when I was designing my layout. And one of them was a run between Merced and the SP interchange to switch cars and, give them the SP cars and pick up the new cars. That would be so boring. And I built a 4th level that you have to get on a ladder to see, but I was going to have somebody up there. It's a logging area, and have someone up there actually getting log cars and another person running down the incline. No one would do that. Everybody else is having fun, and you're just all by yourself. So those fantasies didn't work out.
But Jack, that would give you some place to put the person you didn't really want to invite, but you did anyway.
I don't invite people I don't like.
Well, some people have dispatchers in a little closed room. It's like, that's where you put the guy that you didn't really want to invite, but he came anyway.
Well, okay, then I got to tell you a story that I had 5 guys come over. Tony Custer, Andy Sporandio, Keith Jordan, a couple of other people. And I could only use 4. And I actually had a dispatcher panel in the next room. And they had a train sheet, and they would pick up the phone and record arrival and departure times. And they can control all of the signals at the stations. Well, I had done it several times. It was very boring, but you're just on the phone constantly, writing down. Well, this guy sits there and talks to my wife the whole time guys are running and still does the job. And then he notices that people are running behind. He sets all the signals against everybody, stops everybody. I hear people saying, well, let's go see what the dispatcher's got. He wrote out a train order and he rewrote the timetable. And I've seen on dispatcher records that the YV did the same thing. And you think, how can they do that? Well, you add 2 hours to everybody's time. And then that got everybody back on schedule. And he kept talking to my wife. So I got rid of that dispatcher panel because it was boring. Another boring job.
Probably Jackie was hoarse by the time they were done talking.
Well, I was impressed he could do both jobs at once.
Well, guys, we've come up on 2 hours. It doesn't feel like it, and I'm sure that there's more that could be said about this, but we should probably cut this here. And I do want to thank everybody. Before we end, though, I want to make sure that we sort of plug the event that's happening with the LDSIG and OPSIG virtual meet. So Byron or Seth, I know you guys are very intimately involved with that. Would you like to mention what it is and how people can get involved and participate with that?
Well, we've got we've been holding this meet for a very long time,
but not virtually though. So this is something anybody can.
Virtually, of course. This year's the first time we're doing it virtually. So this year's program is Saturday and part of Sunday, and what we'll have is a series of clinics. They'll be around 30-35 minutes with question and answer. Followed by a design challenge, which is it's a little late to join it now, let's put it that way, but we did have a very interesting challenge about a local subject here in San Jose, and we'll have several panelists presenting their designs and discussing it. So you'll Sydney's posted the link a couple of times. You can see what we've got there. And then we also have what we're calling virtual layout tours, where we've posted a series of links to presentations, either John's videos or a couple of other things about several local layouts. So you get to kind of get a feeling for what we've got going on in the South Bay. And then on Sunday, we'll have panels of the owners. So I think at 11, 12, and perhaps 1, we'll have 4 or 5 owners each time, and they'll be available for question and answer. So, it'll be 7 very high quality clinics, many of them Bay Area people, but because we're able to be virtual and global, we've got people from as far as Saskatoon and as far southeast as Savannah, Georgia. So we got some good presenters, interesting material all about layout design and operation. And boy, we'd love to see you.
And I would just add, Sydney's been sharing the general LDSIG link, which is great and very helpful. We appreciate it. There's also a specific link to register for the meet, and John will have that in the comments section. So we'd love to have you. And John, could I do a 30-second pitch for the LDSIG?
Oh, absolutely. Please do.
So let me bring this up.
Here, I need to also, give me a second here. There it is.
So the Layout Design SIG, we talked a little bit about it. It's a terrific organization, I think. They have a fine magazine, great editor, and we publish the magazine 2 to 4 times per year. Memberships are related to the number of magazines that we publish. There are activities at national regional meets. I really think it's an excellent organization, and you're welcome to check us out at ldsig.org. And you can get the magazine either in paper or as an online only membership, which is much less expensive.
So, hey, Byron, did you see the link that just popped up there? Is this the one for signing up? I didn't. The one I have on the general website that I put into the comments is, let me just pop it up here real quick.
Yeah, the one that's on the screen now with the form site, that takes you directly to the entry form. The other one will take you to the page that describes the meet. That link takes you to the page that describes the meet. It has the link to the entry forms. So
the one that's on now?
Yeah, so the one that's on now that ends in SIGs is probably the best one, so you don't go right into the online form and think, wait, how did I get here? So this is the ideal one.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. As someone that's been to that SIG meet over the past couple of years, I find it fascinating to listen to what people have to say and what they do there. So, as a matter of fact, I've done a couple. I did a video about the SIG meet a couple of years ago. That was, I thought, a really great summation or summary of what the thing is. And I might have posted a link to that recently in sort of anticipation for this show and also for next weekend. So you can find it by looking for LDSIG meet 2019, I think it was 2019. Right here on the channel.
Petaluma? The meet in Petaluma. Yeah, that was it.
Petaluma, yeah. So anyway, is there anything else anybody else wanted to say before we put the wrap on this completely?
Yep.
Last call.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you guys very much. I'm going to make everybody disappear one by one. If you could hang out for just a second, I'd like to talk to you after the credits roll here. So, Mark, thank you very much, and we'll talk to you sometime soon. Byron, thank you. Really appreciate your participation here. Your knowledge is, as always, great to have, and added a lot. So thank you. Jack, what can I say? I'll be looking forward to seeing you. I think it's next weekend or the weekend after that.
Yeah, a couple of weeks.
Yeah, thank you much for taking the time to join. I know this was the first time you were on the panel discussion. I hope you had fun, and hope we'll see you on another one soon.
Got to pick the right subject, and I'll participate.
Okay, we can talk about that too. Thank you. Seth, thank you very much. Connection issues notwithstanding, as always, good to have you with us. And, we'll see you sometime soon. Oh, it's just us, Rob. I better go before people start talking.
Yeah, right.
No, but thank you very much. I do appreciate it. As always, your input is really wonderful. I'm looking forward to the live thing that we're doing. Oh, I just did a spoiler. I'll talk to people about that more on the podcast. We're going to do a live thing here in a few weeks with Rob. So thank you, Rob, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right, you're welcome.
Thank you. All right, and now it's just us, folks. And I have one last thing I wanted to mention. Next month, we're going to have another TSG Live Crew Lounge that's going to be talking about technology in model railroading, and that should be very interesting. And then next weekend on Saturday, it's the 5th Saturday of the month, so we have a little bonus program, which is going to be an interview with my friend Dave Connery, who's a longtime volunteer at Railtown 1897, grew up with trains. He's a master model railroader. It was a very interesting interview, and it was one that we did for the TSG train crew, which if you haven't noticed on the screen here, you can join the TSG train crew yourself by going to patreon.com/TSG Multimedia and support the channel for as little as $2 a month. It's not much, but if enough people do it, it'll add up. So that's it for us here at the TSG Intergalactic Headquarters. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.